Welcome to Liberating Landscapes. I'm Alan Petersen. I have the pleasure of serving as the Curator of Fine Arts here at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And this new exhibition focuses on the work of 6 remarkable women who worked here in Northern Arizona between roughly 1900 and 1940. Let's go on in. So what is a liberating landscape? Well, the exhibition is drawn from the museum's fine art collection. And I wanted to highlight women who worked in Northern Arizona early in the 20th century. And our collection is especially strong in early 20th century artwork. The theme for the exhibit came from the idea that for many women, including the women in this exhibition, when they came from the East, from large cities in the East and came out West, they often found themselves freed from the social constrictions of society at that time, in that they assumed roles that weren't usually being filled by women. They had some independence from men. And in the case of all the women in this exhibition, not all were married, but those who were married, including Lillian Wilhelm Smith and Mary Russell Farrell Colton, their husbands were extremely supportive of their efforts and helped them out tremendously in their careers as artists. Lillian Wilhelm Smith, we're standing in front of some of her watercolors right now, was working as an illustrator and an artist in New York City when she was invited to join Zane Grey on a trip to Rainbow Bridge. And Grey wanted to hire Lillian, who was a cousin of his by marriage. He wanted to hire Lillian to do some illustrations for the book that he saw coming out of that journey, which would be a sequel to his very popular novel, Riders on the Purple Sage. So Lillian joined Zane Grey on what would have been a major expedition at that time. It was roughly a 7 to 9 day overland trip leaving from Kayenta. It would have been a rugged journey overland through sand dunes, rough canyon bottoms, large expanses of slick rock, and it wasn't an easy journey. So they left Kayenta. They had been staying at the Wetherill Colville Guest Ranch, which is depicted in this small watercolor. So this was their home base. And in fact, the Colville Wetherill Guest Ranch was sort of like base camp for adventurous explorers, tourists coming to Northern Arizona in the early 20th century. So they reached Rainbow Bridge after a fairly arduous journey, and Lillian got to work doing watercolors and drawings. And we don't have some of the original work that she did from that expedition in the exhibition, but we do have a couple of paintings of Rainbow Bridge. Lillian was a very adventurous gal, and just, even the idea that she would undertake a journey like that ought to demonstrate that. But she and her husband, Jesse, who was a cowboy and a wrangler and kind of a general all-around roustabout, drove or rode horseback to some of the most remote areas in northern Arizona and southern Utah, New Mexico, in order for Lillian to paint the landscapes of the region. They wound up running a dude ranch or like a guest house in Tuba City. And if any of you remember the ruins at the mouth of the West Fork of Oak Creek, that was a hotel that Jesse and Lillian also ran for some time in the 1940s. So Lillian she would have been a fun gal to know, and she was a wonderful painter. And we have, I think, roughly 15 of her works in our collection here at the museum. Like Lillian Wilhelm Smith, Kate Corey was also working as a commercial artist and a fine artist in New York City at the turn of the century. And a friend of hers, Louis Aiken, had been working out among the Hopi villages doing paintings on commission from the Santa Fe Railroad that were later turned into advertising posters and calendars and that sort of thing. And he returned to New York in 1905, and at a party with some artist friends, he floated a proposal to create an artist colony out at Hopi. I don't know if he talked to the locals about that or if it was just a spontaneous thought, but he was pretty dedicated to the idea. And the only person who actually took him up on the proposal was Kate Corey. So she came out to the Hopi villages to meet up with Louis Aiken and to create a small-scale artist colony. And when she arrived, Aiken had already left. I guess he didn't think anybody was coming. I don't know the full story about how the communication got mixed up, but she arrived at the Hopi villages and no other artists, including the originator of the idea. Lewis had already moved down here to Flagstaff at that point. Anyway, Kate loved the Hopi people and the location and the village life and the social environment, and she wound up spending almost 7 years there. So she really fit in to the culture and did a lot of really fantastic artwork there. The painting over here, Hopi Weaver, is typical of the types of work that she did there. And she also shot a lot of photographs. A major part of our collection here at the Museum of Northern Arizona are the negatives that Kate Corey shot, and we have almost 1,200 of those. And the photos that you see over here are prints that we made from those negatives for the exhibition. And the thing I like about the photographs, there were other people photographing Native Americans and Native American lifestyles and villages. But the thing I really like about Kate Corey's work is that her photographs, and this translates into her paintings as well, are done from the eye of an artist rather than a sociologist or ethnographer. And so they have a much more compelling visual quality to them. And I think really kind of convey the fact that all people are human beings and we're all people, living on the planet together, rather than portraying her subjects as scientific specimens, as the ethnographers and sociologists would. After spending almost 7 years up in the Hopi villages, Corey finally left, and she moved down to Prescott, where she continued to work as an artist. And she was also involved in founding the Smoke Eye Museum, whose mission was to perpetuate the cultural traditions of Native Americans from the region. So she went on to have a very long career. She passed away in the 1950s. And like many of the women here, was a real leader in the art scene in Arizona in the early 20th century. Nora Lucy Mulberry Condell probably traveled the furthest to paint the landscapes of northern Arizona. Nora came from London. Beginning in the early 1930s, she traveled to Marble Canyon specifically, that is the upper portion of the Grand Canyon, to paint the landscapes in the Marble Canyon region, both on the north side of the river and on the south side of the river. And the new Navajo Bridge was up at that time, having been completed in 1927, which made her journey far easier than it might have been if she'd had to travel further to the east to take Lee's Ferry to cross the river. So Nora came from London every summer until the Second World War began. And then she did war work in London throughout the war. And she returned to Marble Canyon when the war was over. And somebody asked me the other day, in the work in this exhibition, are there indications that the women were feminists? Are there any feminist themes running throughout the exhibition? And I hadn't really thought about that in so many terms, because I already imagined, I believe, I think I know, that these women would all be considered feminists. Why? Because even though it's not expressed in their artwork, the very fact that they were traveling alone, in the case of Nora Lucy Mulberry Condell, initially Kate Corey, Lillian Wilhelm Smith was with her cousin, but still to come from New York City to go up to Rainbow Bridge on a 7 to 9 day cross-country hazardous journey, in my mind, is something well beyond adventurous. I think it's even audacious. And I think that although I don't know that any of these women, without going back through their correspondence or books, I don't know that they specifically expressed what today we would identify as feminist ideas. I think by the very virtue of the fact that they were doing what they were doing made them feminists of the highest order. They acted independently. They acted clearly against the social strictures of the late Victorian society, and they basically sought their subject matter and they went after it, and They were not constrained by men in their lives or by standard social convention at that time. So while there are no feminist themes per se, I think that clearly this is a group of feminists. So we only have one three-dimensional artist in this exhibition, and it's Phnom Peo, the famous Hopi potter. And we have here one of her beautiful bowls. I really had hoped to include more Native American artists, but with respect to the ones in our collection, she was the only one who really fit the theme of the exhibition, being women working in northern Arizona between 1900 and 1940. We have many paintings and, of course, pottery by New Mexico artists, but they're kind of outside the geographical region. So Phnom Peo, who's one of my all-time artist heroes, I think, began her work when she was a young girl, and what really put her in the spotlight, although she kind of already was, she was recognized as very gifted at an early age, but what really put her in the spotlight was when her husband, Lesu, began working on the excavations as a laborer at the village of Sikyatki, which had been abandoned and was ruined at that point. And Lesu mentioned to Phnom Peo that they were uncovering these really beautiful pieces of pottery that dated from roughly between 14 and 1600. And Phnom Peo was intrigued, and she was able to view some of the pottery, and it inspired her to recreate, to base her work on the inspiration from this Sikyatki-style pottery. And so combined with her incredible technical expertise and her artistic synthesis of those earlier designs, she came up with a really wonderful contribution to not just Southwestern pottery making, but Southwestern art and Southwestern art history in general, in the broadest sense. One of the great things about Phnom Peo, too, is that her career, along with Maria Martinez would be another example, their careers coincided with kind of the golden age of Southwestern tourism. The Santa Fe Railroad had recently arrived in the Southwest, laying track to California, and the Santa Fe was instrumental in creating a market for Southwestern Native American artwork in conjunction with the Fred Harvey Company. And the Santa Fe Railroad used Native American and Anglo-American artists to create material for promotional purposes, but they also used them for really to draw attention to their, in the case of the Fred Harvey Company, to their facilities and their retail shops. For example, when Hopi House was completed on the south rim of the Grand Canyon in 1905, Phnom Peo was one of the first Native artists that the Fred Harvey Company hired to live on the third floor at Hopi House in the apartment there, and to do demonstrations for the tourists. And there are really wonderful photos of her at Hopi House in 1905, sitting outside. She also traveled to California for some of, in 1915, where she again was doing demonstrations of her art. So here we're standing in front of a painting titled Walpi by Mary Russell Farrell Colton, who's one of the original founders of the Museum of Northern Arizona. And I want to share an anecdote. When a friend of mine heard, I guess through the museum notes or something like that, that we were doing another exhibition of work by women artists, and was disappointed, not sure why, I said, well, of course we are, because they're fantastic. They're fantastic women, they're fantastic painters, ceramicists, and they've been so woefully underrepresented, throughout the history of art, that I think that the more we can pay homage to these women artists, the better it is. And Mary Russell Farrell Colton is another one of my artistic heroes, and I'm so happy to be able to work with her paintings on a regular basis. This is a wonderful work. It's a nocturne. It's painted, as the sun has just gone down, and the color is very subdued. It's got this beautiful, cinematographers refer to this kind of light as the golden hour, even though it's a little bit earlier than after the sun goes down than depicted in this painting. But you can see it's got this wonderful atmosphere with Walpi in the foreground and the San Francisco peaks in the background. And I think I already mentioned this, but nocturnes were a very popular form of art and works in music in the late 19th and early 20th century. Mary Russell Farrell Colton is important for any number of reasons. And one of the most important is that in addition to being possibly audacious or adventurous or however you see them, these artists were also, in many cases, and particularly in the case of Mary Russell Farrell Colton, real leaders in the art scene and cultural scene in early Arizona. There were very few opportunities to exhibit artwork for men or women in Arizona at that time. And women artists in Phoenix were instrumental in getting the art exhibition included in the annual Arizona State Fair. Here in Flagstaff, Mary Russell Farrell Colton began an annual summer exhibition series called the Arizona Artists and Craftsmen Exhibition. And that ran from 1928 until 1935. And like the State Fair, the annual exhibition here in the summer at MNA drew artists from all over the state, from southern Arizona, from eastern Arizona, from Kingman, from the Grand Canyon. Gunnar Widforce brought work down from the Grand Canyon on at least a couple of occasions. And so they were really instrumental in developing the cultural heritage that today, is so important in Arizona. And I think it's important to recognize too that, again, thinking about the idea of feminism, is that when the 19th Amendment was added in 1920, all of these women were very active. They were well established in their careers. And they were really making a difference in the arts and culture scene here in Arizona. Liberating Landscapes is going to be on exhibit until January. So I hope that you can make time to come and see it in person because there's some wonderful artwork here. And the museum has taken great care to prepare our environment for safety during these challenging times. You can purchase timed admission tickets, and the number of people admitted in any given time slot is very low, so you can have an experience that's both quiet and unencumbered by large blockbuster crowds and enjoy some of these beautiful paintings. And again, these all come from our collection. We have roughly 4,000 works of art in the Fine Arts collection. And as I mentioned earlier, our real strength is in this early 20th century time span. Why? Because Mary Russell Farrell Colton and Harold Colton were among the first people to purchase and donate artwork for the creation of our collection. So I hope that you'll come and celebrate the wonderful work done by these women artists and enjoy the rest of the exhibits here. And thank you for your support of the Museum of Northern Arizona.